I want to say this happened in the early summer when our park was full of hikers, campers, and tourists. Montana had its beauty in those summer months, so I couldn't blame him. A lot of the tourists hadn't spent a day camping or even been backpacking before. A lot of them hopped out of their cars to take close up pictures of bison, so you can imagine we had a fair share of people getting lost. Hell, most of the time when I was on tower duty for the summer, I'd spend my time guiding lost hikers back to the trail instead of watching for wildfires. I always pictured being a park ranger as a relaxing job, and that was the case in '95 before everything happened. We didn't think much of it at first. There just seemed to be more cases of rabies, more wildlife we had to put down, which had us carrying our 38s with us whenever we went out. They started putting more rifles in our trucks. I used to complain about having that heavy wheel gun hanging from my hip. It was heavy and got in the way of a pack and made my hips chafe sometimes. I wasn't really used to carrying around a gun. I only shot one maybe a few times, but I stopped complaining after what happened in June. That's when we had the first incident happen at the start of the tourist season. I was laying in my cot at the station, fast asleep, when the phone rang. I grumbled as I sat up and grabbed the phone. "Hello?" I said in a groggy voice. I recognized my supervisor's voice on the other end of the line.
Hey Ash, we got a call at one of the campgrounds. Some kind of disturbance going on there.
I brushed my bangs out of my face as I held the phone on the crook of my neck. "What kind of disturbance?" I asked, furrowing my brow slightly. I heard my supervisor sigh through the static.
I don't know, some people making a huge ruckus after quiet hours. Sound like some rowdy kids blaring some Nirvana or whatever kids listen to.
I yawned and quickly covered my mouth with my free hand. "Who else is going down there?" I asked as I kicked the blankets off my body.
I have Felix on the way over, so I just need you to go with him. Probably drunk or high, so don't get yourself hurt or anything.
I chuckled softly and tapped my foot on the edge of the cot. "All I'm gonna do is tell him to turn down the music in my fancy uniform, Jake." He snorted softly at this.
Yeah, sure, killer. Sorry about waking you up for this, but while the overnighters are tied up on tower duty, the other seasonals haven't really started pouring in yet.
I let out a sigh. Same old story then. Well, I'll call you after I deal with it. It won't take long, so you have a good night, alright? Tell Lauren I said hi.
Thanks, Ash. You have a good night, too.
I hung up the phone and made my way to my locker. It didn't take me long to change into my uniform. I slipped on my jacket and grabbed my belt. I left that stupid wide-brimmed hat and just opted to wear that baseball cap I brought last summer. The station was pretty dead at this time of night, and I made sure to grab a jolt from the fridge before I headed out. I had a feeling tonight would be a long night of paperwork. Probably would need a second one before dawn, knowing me. Not to mention the coffee on the burner here tasted like dirt. I passed Mel at the front desk, wearing a Walkman, probably listening to whatever they constantly blared on MTV, while flipping through the glossy pages of the newest issue of 17. She looked at me and gave me a wave as I returned it on my way out the door. The lot was pretty deserted compared to how it gets later into the season. There were only 2 patrol trucks, mine and Mel's, besides everyone's personal cars, of course. Jake really wasn't kidding about being short-staffed. There was no wind that night. I remember that distinctly more than anything else. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. The moon hung low in the pitch-black night. The only sound I could hear in that quiet parking lot was a great horned owl hooting in the distant tree line, as well as my set of keys jingling on my belt as I walked to my truck. I cracked open the can of Jolt as I put my keys in the ignition and let my truck rumble to life. I pulled out of the lot onto the gravel road and began to drive down. I turned on my radio and tuned into the nearest station. It was one of those late night stations with a barely awake DJ mumbling out song names. This one happened to be playing 80s pop, so could be worse, I suppose. My headlights were my only source of light on those winding backcountry roads. I was glad to be used to traversing the rough roads out here. It wasn't long before I reached the campgrounds. Despite it being early into the season, the campsites were still pretty packed. I pulled through the checkpoint, passing the worn out volunteers stuck on gate duty. There wasn't many lights on at this time of night. The only lighting I could make out from the hazy windows of my truck was from the sparsely placed streetlights and the dim orange glow from dying campfires. I turned around the small bend of the road to see at least 4 cars crammed into a parking space meant for 3. Several tents were set up in random spots around the campsite. Most of them looked like they weren't even staked in properly. Even from the road, I could hear the music blaring from some boombox they had near the still burning campfire. What already stuck out to me was there wasn't really anyone out and about. Sure, it was late, but the boombox was still on and the fire was still going pretty strongly. Someone had fed it within maybe an hour or two. Had they just been so drunk they passed out in their tents? I didn't have long to debate what could have happened when I saw a pair of headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. I quickly recognized it to be one of our trucks. Put my own truck in park and killed the engine. I stepped out and gave a wave to Felix's truck as I heard the sound of a car door opening and closing. I heard a mature but softer spoken voice. Thought you were going to get some sleep tonight. I shrugged as I saw the tall form of Felix saunter into view in his faded uniform. So did I, but here I am. Jake's doing, I'm guessing? He asked as he rubbed under his unshaven chin. I sighed and nodded my head, and Felix gave me a sympathetic smile as he motioned for me to follow him. We both took out our flashlights and began to walk towards the campsite. I wouldn't worry about it, Ashley. It's only your second summer here, after all. I nodded in agreement as my boot crunched a pine cone in half. I know, but feels like I'm left holding the bag sometimes. Felix scratched the back of his neck. Might seem like it, but he's doing it for a reason. I tilted my head slightly as I regarded him. He's testing me? Felix snapped his calloused fingers and flashed a grin. See? You're a smart girl. Think about it. How many out-of-towners flood this place with applications every summer? A lot, I responded as I pondered where he was going with this. Gotta weed out who can't stick it out here. Makes sense. I guess I am a long way from San Diego. He chuckled softly. Miss the palm trees and beaches? Nope. And don't miss the traffic either. We both shared a soft chuckle as we entered the campsite. As we both cleared our throats, putting our minds back into the task at hand, Felix called out in a professional, practiced voice that we were rangers with the park and needed them to turn down the music since it was past the quiet hour. We didn't get a response. I shined my light around the campsite and I noticed several camp chairs set up around the radius of the fire's glow. A few were knocked over to no surprise. I saw some empty cans of Blue Ribbon and half-finished bottles of Jack Daniels. All classic choices for teens who didn't understand what good booze was yet. I took a few more steps into the campsite. The boo box was still blaring Smells Like Teen Spirit in the deserted campsite. I quickly picked up the scented cigarettes from a still lit one resting in a crowded ashtray on a picnic table. Something wasn't right here. Sure, they could be passed out asleep in their tents, but all these cars, all these tents, all these empty chairs, and not a single one is a snorer after a long night of drinking. There was only silence in response to Felix's announcement. We both exchanged looks even in the darkness of the unusual night. There was a hint of worry in the experienced ranger's eyes. He quieted his voice down and got a more focused glint in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Come on, let's check the tents if anyone is in there. I nodded in agreement as I shined my flashlight on the nearby tents. We both split off to check the tents for any occupants. I announced myself before zipping open a tent, expecting to find a drunken couple deep in the moment, but all I saw were empty sleeping bags, scattered magazines, and half-open duffel bags. Some had clothes scattered around on the tent floor, definitely kids my age. The only thing missing were the hammered frat guys sleeping away a night of boozing. I checked the other tents to find more or less the same. Me and Felix met back up near the campfire, both of us not finding the campers yet. It's like they wandered off, I said softly to him. They couldn't have gone far. Their cars are still here after all. He rubbed his chin in thought as he shined his beam near the edge of the campsite. He seemed to focus on something I couldn't see very well from the angle I was looking at it. Hey Ash, come look at this, he said as he walked over towards the edge of the campsite, shining the beam of his flashlight at something on the ground. I made my way over to his side. What is it? I inquired as I squinted down at what he was looking at. See some prints going to the woods. Might looks like elk. Kinda looks like there's some drag marks here too. Drag marks? I replied as I furrowed my brow. Yeah, looks pretty fresh too, he added with a frown forming on his face. Think we should call Jake about this? Felix took in a deep breath as if he was in thought for a moment. Not yet. I need to grab something from my truck. Come on. A sense of unease had begun to descend upon me ever since we found the empty campsite. At the time, I didn't know why. Felix opened the back door and dug through a large duffel. I almost asked what he was looking for, then he pulled it out. A strange rifle, loading it with a stripper clip of 308s. It wasn't like the long, sleek rifles and the glossy Cabela's catalogs that came in the mail. This one was almost ugly. The wood was worn and unpolished, the barrel stubby but menacing, like it had come from another era. He racked the bolt with a sharp motion, then turned to look back at me. What? It's bear country, Ash. Is that what you think happened? A grizzly snatched them? I don't know. He sighed and rubbed his face with his free hand. We do need to make sure they're okay. I know if we called Jake, he would just write it off or make us wait for hours till County gets here. I replied as Felix nodded in agreement. He would, so let's give him something he can't ignore, he said as he put his flashlight back on his belt and replaced it with a clunky headlamp. We both set out to follow the drag marks. We didn't say anything as we began to walk into the shadowy tree line. Every couple of steps we called out if anyone was out there and if they were lost. Our voices reverberated across the pines. We shined our lights around the surroundings, looking for any sign of these drunken college kids. The night was still, soundless. Not even a single bird or bug could be heard. I couldn't even feel a single gust of wind. I kept listening for the smallest sound, any sign of someone lost out there. I felt my stomach begin to swirl. We couldn't even hear the music anymore. It's like the air itself was siphoning the sounds of the night away. That's when I finally saw it, hiding in a collection of vegetation, a pair of eyes staring back at me. I shined my light on it and my eyes quickly widened. A young, teary-eyed woman stared back at me with blonde hair just like mine. She was kneeling down by a man that looked to be around the same age as her. A large seeping gash was ripped across his leg. He didn't seem to be conscious from the blood loss. One of the woman's petite hands was tightly pressed against his wound. Her other hand clutched his. Her face was deathly pale. I could see her whole body was shaking. She seemed to struggle to keep her breathing under control. Several times she kept opening and closing her mouth to say something to us, but her words refused to leave her mouth. She had several small cuts adorning her exposed arms. Her delicate face was cut up like she had been scratched up by branches from a hasty escape. Who I assumed to be her boyfriend had similar cuts on his face. I felt frozen in place as I put a hand to my mouth. I kept screaming at my legs to move, but they wouldn't. In fact, I couldn't feel them at all. That girl's face, desperate for anything, anyone that could help her escape this horrible place. I finally swallowed my fear and finally sprang into action, and so did Felix. I kneeled down beside the couple and set my bag down, practically ripping it open to get my first aid kit out. Felix was faster than me. His hands were shaking less than mine. I yanked out some 4x4 and started to press it into the wound as Felix started to get out some roller gauze and help me wrap it up. The girl still clutched his hand for dear life, never leaving his side. I had to gently move her hand aside from the wound so I could help Felix bandage it up. She didn't ever raise her voice or make much of a sound besides some almost inaudible murmurs. Even though I couldn't make out her exact words, I could tell she was praying. "Ash, take care of her. I got him," he said as he quickly took control of the situation. I took the woman's bloodied hand into my own, not giving a shit about the blood right now. She turned her gaze to me, asking a silent question. "We'll take care of him. Don't worry," I said in my best reassuring voice. She quickly nodded and finally released her iron grip from her boyfriend's hand. Felix quickly hefted the young man over his shoulder and nodded to me. "Thank you," the girl murmured to me as she held onto my hand tightly like it was her only lifeline. "Come on, we need to go, okay?" I said gently to her as her green eyes flickered over to the trees deeper into the woods. "Wait, no, my friends are still out there." She finally raised her voice to my surprise. Felix noticed my hesitation and answered for me. "Look, miss, we need to get him to a hospital or he won't make it. We're going to call for more rangers to find your friends, alright?" This seemed to satisfy her well enough, and she nodded a few times and sniffed. "Right, I'm sorry, It's alright, you don't need to apologize, let's just get you out of here," I added as Felix started to jog back with the wounded man still over his shoulder. I led the terrified girl through the darkness by her trembling hand, flashlight in my other. I could hear Felix's heavy footsteps crunching pine needles ahead of me. "Are they gonna be okay?" she asked anxiously, her eyes darting all around. "They'll be okay," I replied, not believing my own word. Even though I was definitely not alone, I could still feel something else, but I don't even know how to describe it. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I could feel eyes bearing their gaze upon me, but I couldn't tell from where. I quickened my pace slightly, tugging on the girl's arm to get her to move a bit faster. "What's your name?" I asked her, trying to take my mind off the sensation. She hesitated to answer for a few moments before finally speaking up. "Jessica." She tried to add a smile to it, but her nerves failed her. "I'm Ash. The big guy who grabbed your boyfriend is Felix," I said, looking over my shoulder at her with a soft smile. She slowly returned the smile with some hesitation. I could tell we were getting closer to the campsite by the sounds of grunge echoing through the shadowy trees. We finally reached the dim glow of the campfire. I could see Felix by his truck with a young man laid out on the truck bed with a hastily made bandage now wrapped in Coban. Felix stood close by, one hand resting on the edge of the truck bed, the other holding the receiver of an old Motorola bag phone. The bulky nylon case sat beside him, the coiled cord stretched just far enough to let him pace a little. I assumed he was calling Jake or someone from the emergency line, but I couldn't tell. His voice was low, tight. Whatever he was saying wasn't for me. Jess broke away from my grip and ran over to her boyfriend's side. Even though he was still unresponsive, I could see his chest rising and falling, the slight vibrations in his torso from his still beating heart. As Felix was busy, I walked over to the boombox and finally shut it off. I turned back and made my way over to Jess's side as she tapped her fingers on her boyfriend's open palm. I finally asked the question that had been circling like a vulture in my mind this entire time. "What exactly happened out there?" I asked as I rested my arms on the top side of the truck's bed. Jessica's eyes averted mine as she stared at the ground. "I don't know where to even start," she said as she rubbed her face. I quietly waited for her to continue as I pressed a hand to her shoulder. 1 second, we were drinking, having fun. Then it was just. She pauses as she wipes her eyes, taking a moment to compose herself. The music was so loud, but I could hear Eric screaming when it grabbed him. Something grabbed him? An animal? A person? I don't know. I never got a good look at it. It started to drag him into the woods, and my legs just started moving on their own. I don't know what came over me. I took a small notepad out from my shirt pocket and started scribbling some notes as she spoke. It helped keep my shaking hands busy. What about your friends? Did they do the same? She gave me a short nod. They did, but I was first. I saw so much red. I grabbed the pocket knife he gave me for my 16th and I stabbed it again and again, and it made these awful sounds. Did you kill it? I asked with a raised eyebrow, and she gave me a slight shrug. I don't know, but it let him go and everyone else just scattered. I panicked. We all did. I didn't know what to do besides hide and hope it doesn't find us again. It sounded like it was screaming like a person when I stabbed it. I stopped writing and looked up at her, truly at a loss about what she was even describing. None of it made any sense to me. My only guess was a mountain lion or some psycho. Both sounded far-fetched the more I thought about them. Mountain lions prefer easy prey, people alone, people isolated. Not a packed campsite full of noise. Even if they were starving, it still just didn't stick. Perhaps it was a person, some kind of deranged psycho or crackhead living in the woods, targeting clueless campers. It sounded like the plot of some shitty slasher, one with a mass serial killer. Then again, he would be a pretty shit one if all it took to stop him was a half-sober, petrified sorority girl with a pocket knife that she probably hadn't used for anything besides cutting nails and whittling out boredom. A silence fell on us as we quietly waited for our backup. Felix stood closest to the wood's edge with his rifle posted up on his truck. Every couple of minutes he would turn on his headlamp and scan the tree line. He never saw anything. I draped a blanket around Jess. She wouldn't stop shivering, even as the minutes drew by and what felt like hours. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, but I didn't know why. The woods still didn't make a sound even as I felt a gentle breeze brush upon my face. Finally, we all heard the sound of approaching sirens from the distance. All three of us peeked our heads up. Our backup was finally here after what felt like an eternity. I first noticed the red flashing lights from a county ambulance with peeling paint, followed by a couple of our trucks, but not the dull flashing amber lights like I had on my truck. Just like your run-of-the-mill city cop, they had red and blue lights flashing brightly against the cedars and pines. At the back of this convoy was a single black and white county patrol car. I was honestly surprised they bothered to send one out here. Must have been a slow night. They quickly pulled into the turnoff for one of the empty campsites and killed the wailing of their sirens. The Rangers stepped out first, but they didn't dress like us. Me and Felix wore cargo shorts, faded t-shirts, tired polo shirts with cheap name tags pinned on, and dusty hiking boots. These Rangers wore tan-collared shirts and dark green cargo pants, black danners. I quickly noticed some of them wore those detestable wide-brimmed hats, but a lot of them also wore baseball caps. Each of them wore a high-vis vest stamped with law enforcement in large, bold letters. They slung scoped game rifles or semi-auto shotguns, likely loaded with bear slugs, over their shoulders. A few of them carried bulkier, heavy-duty tranquilizer rifles with longer scopes. I noticed clunky handheld radios dangled from their belts. No doubt these were the usual guys they called in when the wildlife got too bold. They didn't say anything to us, but Felix said we could help look for the missing campers. These weren't the rangers that smiled and waved from behind desks at the visitor centers or headed out trail maps at junctions. These were the guys who he called in to track and kill a 1,000-pound grizzly that mauled a camper. These were the guys who carried the bodies of the lost out of ravines. They worked in places where the nearest backup was hours away. Small crowds began to gather, drawn by the lights and sirens screaming in well after the quiet hours. Barefoot kids peeked out from dome-shaped Power Ranger tents, Game Boys in hand. The soft, sickly golden glow from their warm lights illuminated the quietly worried faces. Flannel-clad dads sat in their folding chairs outside their RVs, Miller High Life still cold from the coolers, trading guesses about why all the uniforms are out here. Mothers in hoodies gently tried to herd their kids back to bed. The flashing lights painted the pines in red and blue long after the sirens had gone quiet. I looked over at the ambulance as two guys in plain navy blue cargo pants and windbreakers carted away Eric in a stretcher, with Jess hovering close by. One of the newly arrived rangers handed us some handheld radios and muttered something about not chasing after grizzly bears. They turned on dark green angle lights clipped to their vests and split off into pairs as they carefully entered the tree line, their rifles held low. Our radios crackled with their chatter.
Station, this is Ranger 8. We're gonna need SAR volunteers routed up to cover this much ground, over. Copy that. We'll assemble a search party. Stand by. 10-4.
I turned down the volume of my radio as me and Felix ended up being paired off together. I noticed the deputy they dragged along with them was talking to another guy not in any kind of uniform. Button-up shirt and slacks with a badge clipped to his belt. The sidearm was concealed in the leather shoulder holster. I assumed he was some kind of detective, but wasn't sure what he was going to investigate in this neck of the woods. I was sure this was just another rabid animal to be put down, just like the other reports. Felix still took the lead, the rifle hanging over his chest. I was glad to be paired up with him. From the way he was able to follow those tracks from before, all those hunting trips he had been taking with his son had finally paid off. I was a little jealous after the fact, but I never figured out why. As we were walking under the shadowy arms of the spruces, flashlights in hand, I first smelled it. Something that stuck out from the usual scents of the forest of Montana. There was hardly even wind to carry it, so it took me a second to register what I was even smelling. Honestly, it was pretty repulsive when it finally hit me. I caught a whiff of what smelled like ammonia, like someone had been pouring jugs of bleach out in the middle of the woods. I looked down to see if it had been something I stepped on, but I furrowed my brow as the dull, golden gleam of my flashlight reflected the sight of clotted droplets of blood clinging to pine needles and fallen leaves. The droplets continued down the makeshift game trail. Neither of us said a word to each other. Felix muttered a short transmission into the radio. He turned to me and we exchanged a nod and kept going. The smell only got stronger as we kept walking. The blood started to get more visible, going from sparse drops to scattered puddles. Felix started walking closer, taking more deliberate steps, now heel to toe, muffling the stomping of his boots crunching pine needles. We finally reached the end of the blood trail. The smell was almost unbearable now. I felt lightheaded from the overwhelming stench. We both stopped in our tracks at what we heard. From the sounds, I could hear it making. The way it wheezed, I could tell it was struggling to stay alive. It emitted a series of harsh gasps and sputters. I felt like I was about to throw up from even being near it. I squinted my eyes as I finally could make out where the sounds were coming from. The shadowy shape lay on its side, staring at us from under a birch. Even though I couldn't see its eyes, I could feel them bearing their weight down on my skull. I swallowed my nausea and my fear, and finally shined my light on it. Our eyes widened at what we saw. I wanted to run away from this thing and never think about it, bury out of my mind, but my primal focus seemed to take hold. I would have thought it was an elk if I had just glanced at it for a split second, but it wasn't one. At least not anymore. It used to be a bull, still had those velvety furred antlers from a still early summer. Its eyes were clouded, colorless like a corpse. I couldn't tell if it had pupils anymore. Its eyes kept twitching, almost like they were loose in its sockets, about to pop out at any moment. It was still laid out on its side, its head raised to continue to gaze at us. Some of its fur was matted with blood. It looked like it was its own blood. Its jaws entirely misshapen. I was about to wonder why when I got my answer. It opened its gaping maw. It had too many teeth. Rows and rows of newly grown incisors was tightly crammed into its original set of teeth like a shark's. Its newly grown teeth were coated in fresh blood. The sounds it made, like it was gurgling and choking on its own blood. That's when I finally noticed where Jess made her mark. Sticking out from between its collarbone and shoulder was the hilt of a buck knife. Blood still seeped from the fresh wound. I shined my light down to its legs as it began to move. All four of its legs were bent and twisted into horrible angles. Its length extended beyond the realm of possibilities. Bones jutted out like spikes from its horribly mangled limbs. Despite the fact it shouldn't have been able to stand, let alone move at all, it still did so. I still heard its legs crack and crunch as limbs began to snap and break in new ways with each passing moment. It should have been screaming, howling in agony, but it didn't make a sound. It only let out soft retching and a window of gagging. I felt bile begin to travel up my throat with every bone it snapped further into impossible angles. Felix still had the rifle. "Cover your ears," he commanded with a slight waver in his voice. I didn't question it or hesitate to do as he said. I could tell Felix was trying to put on a brave face around me. Not because he wanted to look macho or impress me or anything like that, but he knew I would panic if a veteran ranger like him lost his cool. I could still hear it in his voice, the slight hesitation in his words, his normally tanned face pale as that thing's eyes. It was in the process of walking forward when I finally heard the deafening roar from Felix's rifle. It didn't even seem to register that it had been shot. The gaping hole was now barreled in between its eyes. Felix wasn't bullshitting about those hunting stories after all. Blood began to bleed from its new wound. It sat on its haunches and flexed its jaw a few times as it rocked its head up and down. It crumpled over to the side and began kicking its back legs wildly. After less than 30 seconds, I let out a few more twitches before falling motionless entirely. A puddle of blood began to form under its slack-jawed face. Our radios started to squawk with questions on who fired that shot. We both let out a collected breath that we'd been holding on to this entire time. I heard the sound of Felix charging the bolt and ejecting the still smoking brass from the chamber. The scent of ammonia began to fade away as the aroma of carbon and gunpowder filled my nostrils. I didn't say anything, but with trembling hands he grabbed his radio and spoke into it. "All stations. 1 round fired. Aggressive. Wildlife is down. Situation is under control." There was a long silence on the air, and Felix spoke again. "Bring gloves."
10-4.
I reached into my pack and got something I didn't think I would be using at this moment, but I felt compelled to do so. I grabbed my Polaroid camera. It was a gift from Mom 2 summers ago before I left. I promised her I would take pictures of the park for her. I hung up pictures of hot springs in my locker. The breathtaking views of the snow-covered mountains and extinct volcanoes from the balcony of a lonely fire tower. I sent them back west in half-crumpled envelopes. I never thought I would take a picture like this. The camera's flash filled my vision as my camera spitted out a newly printed Polaroid. I began to shake the photo as it began to develop. A small comfort was brought from doing such a mundane and familiar task. I expected Felix to say some cheesy one-liner from a trashy action movie to cut the tension, but he never did. I looked over him. His rifle was now slung over his shoulder. He clutched it tightly, his fingers trembling, his knuckles snow white. I could hear his soft, unsteady breathing. I reached out slowly and rested my hand on his arm. He flinched at first, his head twitching towards me on instinct. I didn't pull away. Instead, I tightened my grip just a little. He closed his eyes, breathed in, and breathed out. Then he nodded. "I'm fine, He softly murmured, not finishing his sentence. I gently caressed his forearm with my fingertips before pulling my own hand back. My fingers were still shaking. The sound of dry leaves crunching approached us as the beams of 2 flashlights drew near. We looked over to see 2 law enforcement rangers walking up quietly to the body of this thing. I expected them to say something as they shined their beams over what lay there, but they didn't. One of them nodded at Felix, who still held the rifle, the barrel smoking ever so slightly. The taller ranger set his bag down and pulled a bright yellow Kodak from a smaller compartment inside a Ziploc bag. He raised the camera and took a quick photo with a soft snap as the flash lit up the carcass. He stepped closer, focusing the lens on the hilt of the knife. Then he stowed the camera in his cargo pocket and scribbled down the frame number in a short note in a small notebook before giving a nod to the second ranger. The second ranger unfolded a black tarp from his pack and draped it over the misshapen elk. He cracked a blue chem light and taped it to the tarp with a strip of surveyor's tape. One of them reached for his shoulder mic and spoke into it. "Station, this is Ranger 3. We got a DB flagged with a blue chem light. Northwest, 800 meters into the tree line. Over."
Copy. DB marked with blue chem light. Southwest. 800 meters into the tree line. Out.
Neither Felix nor I said a word. I expected them to lose their composure, to stammer out some half-witted explanation of what we were looking at, but they didn't. I could have sworn I heard one of them mutter another one under their breath. This wasn't their first time. One of them finally looked back over at us. "You two, head back. Jake's waiting for you by the trucks." Felix nodded quietly. I didn't move. He started to walk away, but he quickly noticed I wasn't following. I was still staring at that tarp, the misshapen cloven hooves still barely visible from the edges of the tarp. Felix put a hand on my back and gently urged me forward. "Come on, Ash," he said quietly. I just silently nodded and followed him back towards the trucks. We didn't say anything to each other during the walk, but Felix was walking a bit slower than before. He kept his rifle close, holding it tightly. As we walked, he would shine his light into the trees as we passed them, but we never saw anything. The flashing lights guided us through the quiet forest. It didn't take long for us to get back to the campsite and all those emergency vehicles. The crowd was still there, now a few more strong with the gunshot they probably heard. Among the lines of emergency personnel was the shape of my supervisor, Jake, leaning up against his truck. Red and blues painting his face as he took a long drag from a lit cigarette as he spoke to what I assumed to be some kind of detective or government official from earlier. The ambulance had already left with the couple. The two of them stopped their conversation as we approached them. The well-dressed man looked over at me and gave me a warm but professional smile. I'll admit, he was a lot better looking than most cops I had seen. He was clean-cut, sharp as a razor, maybe a little older than I usually go for. He honestly looked like he could have made it as an actor out in Hollywood if he tried. "Ashley, I assume?" he said with practiced politeness. I nodded as he continued speaking. "I know you've both had a long night, so I won't take up your time." He reaches into his pocket and hands us 2 laminated cards. "Here's my card. If you want to talk about what happened after some rest, feel free to give me a call." I looked down at it and squinted slightly at the neatly printed text. Detective Reed Callahan, Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office. Following that, his badge number, phone number, office address, and his faxing number. Sure, I said, nodding a little as I pocketed the card, feeling the need for sleep gnawing at my brain. Jake glanced over at me, noticing just how worn out I looked. Both of you did amazing work tonight, finding those two. You two can go and have the next few days off. We'll sort the reports when you get back. We thanked him and he tossed a pack of Marlboro Reds to each of us, but I didn't smoke. Me and Felix silently shambled back to our trucks. Before he climbed into the driver's seat, I wordlessly pushed the pack of smokes into his hand while trying to manage a smile, but it probably looked pretty pathetic. I could only stare as the flashing lights filled my vision and wondered, why? Why did this have to happen to me? Why did this have to happen to us? We both drove back to the station, handed in our gear, and changed. I could still smell the faint odor clinging to my uniform. I suppressed the urge to gag as I threw it back into my locker without any finesse, just wanting to get it off me. I changed into a pair of cut-off jean shorts and my UCSD hoodie. I bumped back into Felix on my way to my car. He was wearing that stupid Broncos windbreaker like it was his best suit. He looked almost as exhausted as me. We both exchanged a tired hey to each other. I'm going to Norm's. You want to come? I'm buying. I tried to let out a chuckle, but it only came out as a weak exhale. That old place? Just this once, I need a drink. I stammered out, trying to keep it together. Last thing I wanted was to put on the waterworks in front of him. Felix's gaze softened as he quieted for a moment. Me too. Come on, Ash. I'll drive, alright? I sniffed once and he put a hand on my back and gently ushered me to his truck. We didn't say much as we climbed into his truck and he started to drive me towards town. I gazed out the dim window into the dark outlines of the pines. My head pounded with the aftershock of pure adrenaline leaving my body. I clenched my fist tightly as I felt my hands continue to tremble. I let out a couple unsteady breaths to control my breathing. It helped a little. I finally mustered up what little confidence I had and turned towards Felix. His eyes were focused on the road, but I could tell he noticed with how tightly he clenched his jaw. He quickly cut me off before I could finish. You have nothing to be sorry for. I let out a quiet sigh and let myself relax a little, not really in the mindset to argue with Felix. There was still one question that had been swirling in my mind. What was that? Felix's expression darkened as his eyes flickered to me and then back to the dimly lit road ahead. Between you and me, I heard some whispers from the badge rangers about this. My brow furrowed as more questions flooded my brain. I turned my head and quietly asked him, You knew about this? He shook his head a few times. I thought it was a spike in chronic wastings or rabies or anything, just not that. I didn't know what to say, but my hand slid across the center console just short of touching him. I didn't know why, I just didn't want to feel alone after that. I just wanted to feel close to someone for a moment. I felt his hand squeeze my arm just for a second before he withdrew his hand. I retreated my hand back to my seat and stared ahead wordlessly. We both didn't say anything else the entire ride into town. The small town of Ravenwood was dead quiet in these later hours of the night. The only place that was still open was that shitty gas station at the edge of town, that Chinese takeout place that I never went to, and Norm's. The truck drove past the main street, if you could call it that, until we reached the edge of one of the last blocks before it turned into scattered neighborhoods. On the street corner was our destination, Norm's, the only place to get a drink besides the liquor store on the edge of town that closed after 7, and that pizza place that was full of screaming kids. It didn't look like much on the outside. Concrete brick walls stained from decades of cigarette smoke and spring thaws. A slightly angled roof to keep the snow from piling up in the winter. One-way windows only hinted at the warmth inside, backlit by a flickering neon Coors Light sign hanging above the glass door. Felix parked along the curve and gave me a nod before stepping out. I didn't move at first, exhausted in a way I couldn't even begin to explain. After a weak sigh, I followed him in. The bar was dimly lit, low-hanging lights casting long shadows across wood-beamed walls. A few regulars sat on worn vinyl stools, nursing nearly empty beers and clutching half-spent cigarettes. The thick scent of tobacco hit me like a punch to the gut. We passed through the vestibule into the main bar. A battered jukebox flickered quietly in the corner. Across the room, a doorway opened to a second space I couldn't quite see. A wood stove, untouched and cold under summer months, leaned close to the doorway. Norm leaned against the back counter. The flashing Rainer sign behind him cast a dull red glow across his lined face as he wiped down a glass. Felix settled into his seat at the bar, but I didn't follow him, not yet. My gaze drifted to the jukebox as it quietly played For What It's Worth, but for some reason the usually calming twang of Buffalo Springfield didn't quite sit right with me. Not tonight. I quietly cycled through the different CDs, quickly noticing didn't have anything newer than 88. I grumbled softly as I cycled CDs to something my dad liked to listen to on the porch during the weekends. Gimme Shelter. I dug into my pocket for some loose change and fed the machine a pair of quarters. My gaze shifted as I noticed the dark form of a dog that you might call a lab if you squinted, lying across his warm bed next to the jukebox. I smiled softly as I watched this dog snore softly as he rested his blocky head on his paws. The jukebox started to play my song. The dog let out what I best could describe as a grumble as he lifted his graying muzzle to gaze up at me. His ears flicked as he squinted in what might be a judgmental stare at the jukebox as it played the Rolling Stones tune. I let myself smile as I kneeled down to him and softly scratched behind his floppy ears. "Did I wake you? I'm sorry, sweetheart." His tail thumped once on the tiled floor as he leaned into my hands with another grumble. I peered at his leather collar to see he shared the name of the beer of questionable quality, Bush. I let out a quiet chuckle, barely audible even to myself. I patted the lounging dog once more before standing up. As I walked back, I caught the gaze of one of the regulars just for a moment before he dropped his gaze to his beer. I didn't linger on this as I sat down at the bar next to Felix. Norm nodded at me as he poured Felix a draft. When he finished, he turned my way. Definitely a local through and through, mullet and handlebar stash, faded denim trucker's jacket, aviator-style glasses, a black hat with the outline of some Navy shit sat low on his head, the words USS Okinawa stitched across the front. "Evening, miss. What can I get you?" I hesitated a beat. Just a coffee." He raised a bushy eyebrow at the request, but didn't protest. "Black?" I nodded quietly. I didn't bother asking for cream or sugar. Wasn't sure why I hadn't. Norm grabbed the old coffee pot, probably left simmering on the burner since this morning, and poured a mug of what smelled like the same brand they left out for us at the station. Burnt, bitter, and somehow still comforting. He set it down gently on the bar. I offered a soft thanks and let my eyes drift to the bottles lined up behind him. "I'll take a glass of wild turkey with it. Neat." Norm gave a small, unreadable nod and glanced over at Felix. The two men shared a look, brief but heavy, before he turned back and poured out the bourbon. He placed the glass beside the coffee with a soft clink. I murmured another thank you and without ceremony, poured the contents of the glass straight into the mug. I cupped the plain ceramic in both hands, letting the heat soak into my palms before lifting it to my face. The scent hit me hard, scorched cheap coffee laced with a sharp bite of mid-shelf whiskey. I took a careful sip. The bitterness and the burn slid down my throat and bloomed warm in my chest. I let out a soft, strained exhale as the sting settled across the roof of my mouth, like I was breathing through the ache. I heard a soft grumble from behind me. I craned my head to see the dark form of the bartender's dog padding over from his bed. He plopped himself against my leg as he flopped over with what I could best describe as a dog sigh. I smiled into the mug and leaned down and trailed my fingers along his forehead. He thumped his tail lazily in response. Felix looked over from his beer at the dog sprawled out on my foot, chuckled a bit, and said, "You must really like you. Bush only gets up when you drop an egg," the bartender remarked as he stooped and dug through a mini fridge, bringing out a bright packet of Wonder Bread. I shrugged sheepishly and mumbled, "Guess he does." On the counter, 2 jars sat in cloudy liquid, eggs in one, jerky in the other. The brine was so murky it was hard to tell if the eggs had been there for weeks or years. Strips of meat looked handmade, maybe bison, maybe something else, something with too many tendons. The rack nearby sagged under greasy snack bags, but the fluorescent light above it flickered just enough to make the colors look wrong. The pickled sausages almost looked pink in the shifting light, like fingers in vinegar. The old cigarette machine crouched against the paneling, a faded Cool's logo glowing faintly above it. No buttons, just brass pole knobs dulled to a sickly bronze. A paper label above the slot warned $3.50, quarters only. The ink blurred from years of greasy hands. Behind the warped glass, the packs looked swollen and pale, their colors leached away, brands barely legible through the plastic haze. I looked over at Felix as he nursed his lager. He clutched the half-full glass tightly. Even now I could see his fingers trembling from the aftershock. He wasn't even looking at me, whether because he felt like I needed space or he didn't even know what to say at this point. I couldn't tell. His gaze was focused on the only TV in the bar. A blocky CRT behind the bar played a game show that looked familiar, though I couldn't quite name it. A glamorous blonde in heels and a sparkly red dress moving with the kind of easy practiced grace that made it look effortless. She walked through the glowing panels, flipping them one by one as the audience applauded every nervous guess. The woman was beautiful, tall, slim, with the kind of posture that probably took a lifetime to learn. The tinny bar speakers couldn't keep up with the canned clapping and chimes, but it didn't matter. She held the screen just fine without sound. "You ever wear a dress like that, Ash?" Felix said, still nursing his beer. I let out a soft snort. "Please, I don't have legs like hers." Felix chuckled and gave his glass a small tilt. "Didn't break any hearts back home, Miss San Diego?" I shook my head, a little quieter now. "Me and dating never really worked out. Not exactly a looker." "Hasn't stopped the new volunteers from running into trees around you," he said with a chiding smile. "They're just dumb kids, Felix," I dismissed with a wave of my hand. "Kids can be pretty honest, Ash," he replied matter-of-factly. "Shut up, old man," I grumbled, hiding a forming smile behind my mug as I took a sip. I quickly caught a familiar smell, the kind that drifts through dorm kitchens back home in UCSD. The aroma of a grilled cheese browning on a hot pan. Glancing over, I spotted the bartender cooking a pair of sandwiches on a hot plate, tucked into a tiny corner beside a plain white microwave and a toaster oven. He slid 2 paper plates silently across the bar, one with a freshly made grilled cheese for me, the other a classic hangover special, fried bologna and cheese. I don't even remember asking for them. I Didn't order, I started quietly, but the handlebar mustache bartender cut me off. Eat, girl. You two look like hell. When I asked how much he wanted for them, he just grunted and walked off, busying himself and ignoring my question. I looked over at Felix for help and only got a sheepish smile and a pat on the shoulder. I looked down at the sandwich and accepted my fate as I started to peel off the crusts by hand. I looked down at my feet to see Bush still snoring away softly. I bent down and offered him some of the crusts. I felt the warm breath against my hand as he sniffed it. Without opening his eyes, he gently took it from my hand and chomped away. I smiled softly as I fed him the rest of the peeled crusts. I took a few bites and let myself sink a little further into that bar stool. Just as I was beginning to relax, I heard a sound that I normally didn't pay any attention to, but this time it made my spine tense like a bear trap snapping shut. The sound of rotors cutting through the temperate summer air. Through the windows, I saw the shape of a helicopter flying low, sweeping the tree line, its spotlight searching for any movement in the brush, the strobes flashing dimly as the red and greens of its directional lights glowed steadily. The windows of the bar began to shake as the engine shrilled as it drowned out any sounds of warmth. The dark form of the bar dog raised his head and stared out at that chopper. He didn't make a sound as he watched it comb the tree lines. His ears perked and his eyes focused. The chopper finally turned, and that's when I saw dim blue light illuminating a golden star and black writing that read Montana Highway Patrol. It started to gain altitude as it passed over the bar with a shriek, the rumbling of the spinning blades shaking my very core. In the distant interstate, I could gaze out and see the red and blues flashing wildly as the shapes of emergency vehicles tearing down the highway towards the woods. The howling of the sirens echoing in the distance. I felt a hand grab my shoulder, but I couldn't look away. I didn't say much after that. I finished my drink and noticed Felix had already paid the tab before I could react. We just exchanged a look and we both knew we wanted to leave. We bid a muffled farewell to Norm as we exited the bar. The streets of Ravenwood still carried the distant shrill calls of the sirens deep within the woods. Felix offered to drive me home. He didn't exactly have any reason to say no to him. I wish I could say something else happened on the drive back, but nothing did. I just remember staring out at nothing in particular as we passed the shadowy forms of closed storefronts and isolated houses. When we finally pulled into the small collection of staff cabins, he turned to me as he was about to make his farewell, but I stopped him as I could feel my hands starting to shake again. Can you stay? Just till morning? Felix looked at me in surprise for a moment before softening his expression. You sure? I nodded and he let out an exhale. Alright, I'll crash on the couch. I smiled a little, feeling a little safer that I wouldn't be alone tonight, despite his hesitation to stay. As we both went inside the little cabin, I took in the familiar scent of cheap wood as I tried to make myself at home. A cabin was a strong word. It wasn't like those polished cabins you saw on the lakeside with handmade wooden furniture marketed as a romantic getaway for couples. It was basically a shack with a tiny kitchen and stuff of furniture from the 70s that the feds bought for cheap and a cot with a blue mattress that looked like it had been dragged from Camp Pendleton. Felix settled on the ugly yellow and green plaid couch that I internally gagged every time I set my eyes on it. I took a short shower that somewhat dampened the smell of ammonia lingering on my skin before getting ready for bed. I changed into some comfy shorts and a loose-fitting tank top and finally let my hair down. The rancid smell now being replaced by the stale air and musty upholstery. I looked over at Felix as he lounged in his makeshift sleeping spot on the sofa, eyeing the CRT adorned with bunny ears. His eyes flickered to me as I stood there in my pajamas. Heading to bed? Yeah, Felix, The experienced ranger sat up to fully regard me as he could infer I was about to say something I had been wanting to say for a while. Thank you for everything tonight. If you hadn't been there, I probably wouldn't be. He stopped me from continuing, already knowing where I was going with this. Ashley, there's nothing good that will come from thinking about what could have happened. I know, I say, letting out a deep sigh. I'll be here, alright? Just try to get some sleep on. Right. Night, Felix. Night, Ash. I padded off to the little bedroom they had and tried to get comfortable in bed. The dark green wool blanket from the surplus store smelled like mothballs and not much else, but somehow it didn't make me as itchy like it usually did. I lay there for what felt like hours, my eyes just trying to drift away into sleep after this hellish day. But despite my best efforts, my fatigue wouldn't take me. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing in the woods, its endless teeth as it opened its horrific jaws, the way it thrashed and twitched after Felix shot it, the smell that clung to my uniform and my skin. I sat up, rubbing my face, the images of what I saw not leaving my mind. Giving up on sleep entirely, I climbed out of bed and wandered into the dimly lit common area. Felix still sat on the couch, wrapped up in a fleece blanket as the washy colors from the Phillips brushed over his exhausted face. The CRT quietly murmured a late-night rerun of Are You Being Served? I made my way over to him and sat close by him as the sitcom whispered a canned laugh track. Can't sleep? He said without looking at me. I shook my head and he smiled almost sadly. Yeah, me neither, he said with a heavy sigh. I didn't say anything, but without thinking, I found myself leaning on him, as I felt myself start to shiver, but not from the cold. As the actors on screen, marinated in hairspray, rattled out British cultural references and jokes from the 70s I didn't understand, I felt the blanket being draped around me, just like I did for Jess. The fridge buzzing in the background became the only backdrop besides the TV set. I didn't know when I fell asleep on Felix's shoulder, but whatever small comfort he brought seemed to be enough to lull me into a surprisingly restful slumber. If I had any nightmares that night, they burned away from my memory as soon as the sun rose above the horizon. When the morning finally washed over us, I felt myself making a breakfast and back home that brought a little comfort to me. Rancheros huevos. Despite Felix looking at it strangely, he ate it without protest and said it reminded him of Indian tacos, though I wasn't sure what that even was, but it was nice to cook for someone again. After breakfast, Felix drove me back to the station to pick up my car. Before we parted ways, I embraced him for what felt like hours, but in reality it probably only lasted a couple seconds. He told me to stay out of trouble, but I couldn't look him in the eye when I said I would. Instead of just leaving in my car to wallow what happened last night, I found myself drawn to those swinging glass doors of that shabby ranger station. Every part of me just told me to leave it to the pros. I'm just a college girl who works here seasonally. What good could I possibly do after what happened? Despite all these doubts circling like a tornado, my legs marched towards those double doors, but I know I could never forgive myself if I left. Despite how much busier the station was than usual, I slipped past most of the rangers without any of them even asking where I was going. Phones seemed to be ringing on end as badge rangers with rifles over their shoulders hauled heavy trunks of gear in and out of the station like worker ants. I stopped in front of Jake's office, realizing this was my last chance to turn back. I rested my knuckles on the polished wooden door before rapping my fist 3 times on it. I heard a tired murmur to enter. The scent of cheap tobacco hit me as soon as I entered the cluttered office. Jake sat behind his desk, eyes bloodshot as he cradled a landline across his neck. He lazily blew out plumes of smoke through the half-cracked window at his side. His eyes flickered to me as he gestured to the chair in front of his desk, bidding me to sit. He clenched his jaw as he listened to what was said on the other end. His fist balling on the corded line, he let out a deep sigh before muttering a thank you into the receiver before hanging up. His hand rubbed his face as he attempted to smooth over his disheveled hair. My eyes flickered to the mug bearing the arrow-like mark of the Forestry Service. Many rings of stale coffee colored the inside as a few drops of tar that had long since gone cold lingered at the bottom. I can come back later if now is a bad time, I offered almost sheepishly, like I was letting down my favorite professor. He shook his head into his hand before letting it rest on the desk as he flickered excess ash into a stained ashtray. I'm sure you're here because you want to leave. Well, I can get you a ticket home, probably next week, and I can call in a favor, get you paid still for this season. No, I said almost weakly, rejecting the tempting offer. Jake furrowed his brow as he took a long drag from his cigarette. Then, why are you? I want to go out there. For the search, I stated almost plainly. My supervisor's expression softened as he glazed up at me. Ashley, you don't have to do this. You've done plenty already. I shook my head slightly as I continued to make my case. I know. I'm sorry. He waved his hand almost dismissively. You have nothing to be sorry for. I know what you saw last night. No one will think any less of you if you bow now. I can't. I replied, my ability to form complete sentences seemed to lessen as the conversation continued on. You sure you want to do this? I took a deep breath, despite the persistent cigarette smoke making my nose wrinkle. I'm sure. Look, they found a body of one of them on tribal land, nailed into a tree this morning. This isn't just a dumb group of hikers getting lost. You can still back out of this. A lump settled in my throat as I could only imagine the carnage. When I didn't say anything, Jake stamped out his half-finished cigarette in the ashtray and slid his chair over to the metal filing cabinet and dug through for a particular folder. He set it out on the desk as he gently guided me on what to sign and what to fill out. All right. You're going there armed. It's not a question anymore. You'll be with Stephanie. She's a badge ranger. She's been around longer than me. She knows what she's doing. Thanks, Jake, I said, managing to force a soft but strained smile in his direction. Sure, just stay close to Steph, alright, kid? I don't want one of us being next. I felt a deep weight burrow into my chest cavity at his final warning, but instead I meekly thanked him and got ready for what may lay ahead. Jake gave me a folded map, its corners already creased, showing the search area and the location of the main base camp, before sending me on my way after I packed my bag. Don't get yourself killed to prove a point, he added as he walked me outside, the glass door slamming behind him as he retreated back into the confines of that chaotic station. I found myself on the road once again as my Chevy rumbled along. The base camp, if you could call it that, was basically just a collection of tents and cars made into a little village of what was once a dirt lot for a junction of trailheads. It was a collection of everyone you could think of. Oil-land fire crews in bright Nomex shirts and soot-stained red hard hats moved in neat lines, shovels and pole skis balanced across their shoulders. Nearby, volunteers lounged in ranch jackets and hunting gear, their lever actions and bolt rifles propped against camp chairs as they traded quiet small talk over steaming thermoses. At the center of it all, grim-faced rangers and game wardens crowded around whiteboards and pinned maps spread across folding tables, boots still dusty from the trails, rifles slung over their shoulders as they studied the lines of the terrain. I walked over to the group of rangers as I scanned the crowd for Stephanie. Of course, it wasn't that hard to notice her. She stood apart from the others. The ranger leaned on the hood of her truck, campaign cover canted low over her face, her sun-cut jawline silhouetted in the late morning light. Her pack and rifle rested on the tire as he drew neat lines on a map with a protractor. I walked over with my framed pack hanging over my shoulder. Stephanie tilted her chin to gaze at me as I approached. A few strands of silver slipped across her tan temple. The corner of her lip curled as she regarded me. "So you're the greenhorn Jake is making me babysit." I rubbed the back of my neck before straightening myself up. "I just want to help," I admitted with a forced smile as I fiddled with my pack straps. "Help, huh? Alright, grab that radio. We're heading out." She pointed at a spare boxy radio she had lying next to her pack. I awkwardly clipped it onto my old brown belt and fiddled with the unfamiliar shoulder mic before the older ranger let out a almost amused huff. She stopped over as she murmured at me to let go. Her hands worked quickly as she clipped it onto my uniform shirt properly. I sheepishly smiled at her and thanked her. She slipped on a high-vis vest and donned her pack. "So, where are we going?" I finally asked. Stephanie adjusted her rifle's sling as she flashed a self-assured smile. "Ain't you eager? We're just gonna be walking the line the hand crews cleared for us. Nothing crazy." "Right," I said, gazing out at the newly carved trail. "Got everything? Water, flares, whistle, map and compass, 6-shooter, bear spray, med kits." She listed off almost coldly as she walked forward with her rifle pointing at the dirt. I nodded, almost slightly relieved that I had taken some time to properly pack for this. Stephanie led the way through the line. The makeshift trail was covered in upturned dirt. Small dead trees from destroyed brush peeked out of the soil. Lines of neatly raised earth flanked either side with a surgical clear-cut. I was quietly impressed at the precision, but didn't voice it out loud. Steph walked just ahead of me as a large can of bear spray bounced on her hip, with a fearsome revolver that was much bigger than mine, resting in a well-loved holster. We spent most of the day walking the route, checking for any signs of any activity that didn't come from the team. I felt myself sweating in the summer heat as we hiked along. At around 3, we dropped packs and took a water break and ate some lunch. It was mostly just jerky and whatever trail mix we brought with us. We only continued on a bit longer before the sun started to fall and shadows began to lengthen. But it wasn't quite dusk yet. It was around 4 or so, I think. Stephanie tapped her watch and told her we ought to head back before it gets dark. I didn't offer any protest as we began to walk back. We honestly didn't talk much the whole day. To be honest, I don't think she liked me very much. Probably just doing this for Jake as a favor or something. As I was about to get fully swallowed into my thoughts, I noticed just how quiet it had gotten again. Like a mountain lion was watching me and the birds knew it. Stephanie quickened her pace and told me to keep up. I didn't want to know why. I smelled something that made me stop dead in my tracks and made my entire body rush with a sudden shot of adrenaline coursing into my veins. The scent of ammonia. "Steph, I tried to say, but she cut me off. "Keep walking," she said in a measured but tight voice. The smell only got worse as we continued the march along. It was almost unbearable now. Nausea began to take hold of my senses. Suddenly I heard what seemed to be the sound of branches snapping and thrashing, not like the tiny ones you might find on the forest floor, but the long and sturdy tree limbs high above the ground. I noticed something lumbering across the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and quickly regretted it. Before I could make a sound, Stephanie's hand went over my mouth. I looked over at her to see her staring out at the tree line, her jaw tight. Steph's eyes were like orbs of steel, hardened and focused at the task ahead. With much hesitation, I finally followed her gaze. Skittering with an unnatural gait between the trees, which more resembled a nightmare than an animal. It seemed to be made of borrowed limbs, heads of creatures I knew very well, formed into a spider-like shape, towering over the young fir trees. Steph slowly released her hand from my mouth as she continued to focus on this abomination. "Don't run now, hon. It will chase you down faster than a grizzly with cubs," she whispered gravely to me. My breath hitched in my throat as the sound of my heart pounding in my ears almost drowned out every other sound around me. I slowly drew my shaking hand to my holster, but Steph stopped me with a firm squeeze to my shoulder. Don't. That little pea shooter would just piss it off. She murmured to me as that thing snapped another heavy branch from its mast, brushing against an evergreen with a loud snap. My eyes flickered to the rifle in her experienced hands as my knees turned to jelly. What do we do? Can't you just shoot it? I whispered shakily to her. She turned her head ever so slightly in my direction. She grinned almost amusedly and let out a soft giggle. Oh, bless your heart. This 308 wouldn't put down something this big. Speaking of. She trailed off as she suddenly offered the rifle to me. Hold this for a second. Don't shoot it. As the heavy rifle was thrust awkwardly into my hands, I stood there almost cluelessly. What? What are you doing? I almost demanded as the creature's wolf head canted almost unnaturally to stare at us. Its gums pulled back into a snarl. Just trust me, Ashley. Stay real still now, she said firmly as she reached across her belt and drew a bulky metallic flare pistol. Not like those little shitty orange plastic ones you might find in a regular emergency kit, but the type you might find on a Coast Guard cutter. The Ranger flipped open the signal pistol, almost absent-mindedly, as she dug into a small compartment on her belt and thumbed in a flare shell. With a soft thump, she closed it and took a few steps forward and spread her feet. The thing's heads now focused all their pure white eyes on us. In unison, it opened its maws and let out an unholy cacophony of sounds that I had heard before. A wolf's howl at the moon, a raven's croak and caw, the shrill scream of a mountain lioness in heat, the almost rhythmic bellow of a bull elk in early spring, the mesmerizing song of a loon out on the lake. All these sounds seemed to echo in unison at the back of my skull as they shook the earth. The symphony pounded in my chest as it traveled out my entire body. My ears rang absent-mindedly as I tightened my grip on the useless rifle. Just as the calls ended, I heard the click of the flare pistol's hammer being pulled back. That sounded almost deafening, but I didn't know why. The Ranger let out a sharp exhale as she finally brought the flare pistol to bear. That thing began to charge towards us as it strafed between trees, the trunks rumbling from its weight as its clawed and cloven hooves dug into the bark for leverage. A loud crack tore through the air, and I flinched. A wave of ringing dulled my hearing. A smoke trail hung in the air as the flare slammed into the creature with a fleshy thud. A muted pop followed almost like a firework, then a savage hiss as it ignited. The forest filled with the stench of burning fur and gunpowder. The flare burned like a sun as that thing screamed and thrashed, its disproportional limbs scrambling through the soil as it skidded away faster than an ATV, the signal round still burning red hot against its flesh as it fled. The cries of agony faded into the distant echoes as the trees swallowed its form, while the pounding of my heart and the ringing in my ears dominated my senses. The older ranger stood still for a moment before turning the smoking signal pistol over and dumping the spent shell. Her washed-out voice murmured something to me, but I only stared blankly at her as she carefully retrieved the rifle from my death grip. Her hand wrapped around my arm as she dragged me back towards the camp. She didn't offer any explanation or waste any words trying to reassure me in the moment. The sun only fell further behind the horizon as the twilight descended upon us. The trail shifted as it paralleled the nearby highway. Ahead, a line of dark patrol cars blocked the road, their light bars burning, fused into a makeshift barrier. A state trooper in a crisp tan uniform stood in front with a shotgun across his chest, his campaign hat silhouetted against the glow. The lawman carved a wide circle in the air with his mag light. Lines of confused, road-tripping families, packed into wood-paneled station wagons and minivans, reluctantly took the graveled crossover and sped back down the interstate. Other troopers lingered by their cruisers, sweeping spotlights through the trees. Stephanie and I exchanged a glance and let out an exhausted sigh. Come on, ain't no use staring. Let's get you something to eat back at camp, she said gently, but her voice carried a tightness that I hadn't heard before. When we reached camp, we settled around our little fire we set up for the night. The ranger settled in her folding chair, now with her hat resting on her knee. Her silver-streaked bun now loosened as she brought a cigarette to her lips. Just before she could light it, it tumbled out of her hands. Her fingers shook as she let out a soft curse and balled her hand into a fist. I observed this but didn't say anything as I heated up some ramen over a sterno. I let out an exhale before finally speaking up, trying to keep my voice steady. How can you be so calm about this? Steph's silver eyes focused on me as she lit up her retrieved Zippo. You get used to it, she said almost dismissively as she took a long drag. That's it? You just get used to it? I asked incredulously. Well, before all this happened, us badge folk didn't exactly do what y'all seasonals do and go home. You ever been up to Yellowstone? Maybe once, I think, I replied, raising an eyebrow, wondering where this was going. You know those thermal pools? She asked, and I responded with a nod as she took a long drag before continuing. Yeah, so back in 81, when I was a young pretty thing like you, had this couple go off the trail into the pools to find somewhere to skinny dip, and Yeah, I said with a sigh as I rubbed my neck. I'm sure, she says with a wiry smile. Well, the boyfriend gets close to test the water and he falls right in. Didn't even scream much, but she sure did when she ran to get us. Was he dead? Well, I wish that's all he was, she says with a soft but empty smile on her suntanned face. Jesus, I muttered to myself. By the time we got there, the pool was like sludge that reeked like pennies. There were nothing to pull out besides a few clumps of hair and some ripped up cloth and that smell. They must have closed the park, I mused out loud as I stared at the floating block of instant noodles in my mess cup. The ranger across from me grinned like a shark, but it didn't reach her eyes. Think so? Ain't you sweet? Nah, all they did was add another sign, and that was that. Family tried to sue, but got dismissed. That's awful, I said, not really sure what else to even say. Steph agreed with a nod before continuing on. Sure, but it's just another thing to deal with. Just like the Chimera, the bears, and the tourists. The Chimera? I said, finally looking up. That's what we call it. Like that old Greek story. Thing has been prowling since last April. First, it took a hunter in his deer stand, then a hiker here and there. Those drunk kids are probably next. At this point, they're probably all dead, she stated flatly with self-assurance plainly heard. How can this happen? Why don't they shut the park down? Stephanie finally softened her expression as her gaze met mine. I wonder that too, most nights. I didn't respond as I stared at the campfire crackling and popping in the night. The woman let out a plume of smoke before sagging her shoulders. Ash, honey, you should get some rest. You had a long day, she said with a gentler tone. I managed to smile and muffle goodnight before plopping myself in one of the foldable cots for the night. For some reason, I was able to actually sleep better tonight. I wasn't really sure why, but I didn't really care. I wish I could say that would be my worst night so far, but I would later be proven wrong once again. In the morning, things were different. The mood around camp had shifted entirely as the volunteers seemed to be packing up their tents to their Broncos. Steph watched from afar in her camp chair with her rifle on her lap as she clasped a tin of black coffee. What's going on? I asked her. She grunted and gestured to the blue percolator sitting nearby with a swing of her head. Coffee first. I let out an almost amused huff as I poured myself a cup. I looked around for any sugar or creamer, but I realized quickly it was a lofty fantasy. I sat down close by, wrinkling my nose at the sensation of slightly burnt Maxwell House coating my throat. Why is everyone leaving? I finally asked. They found another body, she said without looking at me. I raised an eyebrow. Shouldn't we bring more people here then? He had a 22 in his leg, she said casually as she took a long sip from her chipped mug. Someone shot him? Mm-hmm. State Bird found him on a ridgeline without a shirt. Guess he was smart enough to use his shirt to stop the bleeding, but lost too much blood, so hypothermia did the rest. How could have that happened? Jess didn't mention hearing a gunshot. No? Scared girl like her ain't reliable. Memory's a fickle thing when shit hits the fan, she remarked while rolling her neck before continuing. Some of the deputies think one of them was packing a pea shooter to score some pussy and wound up shooting each other in the panic when that thing came for him. Or maybe it's some jackass spotlighting off season. Spotlighting? I asked, tilting my head ever so slightly. Yeah, shining a beam on a deer at night so it freezes up, makes it easy to drop him. Illegal as hell. So, what does that mean for us? It means you're probably getting benched. They already send the volunteers back. Seasonals are next on the chopping block. I let out a long sigh. Guess I should start packing then, I muttered. Well, reckon you should, she replied offhandedly. It didn't take long for me to gather everything up. I sat on my pack, not sure what to even do at this point. You really ought to head on home, Ash, Stephanie remarked as she pored over a map with a marker in hand. That's what everyone keeps saying. They just want me to sit this one out. Frustration slithered into my voice as my fist balled. The ranger turned her head to gaze at me from over her shoulder. It ain't 'cause we don't think you can stick it out here, girl. I grit my teeth a little as days of pent-up fury from these tragedies started to overflow into my throat. I just want to fucking do something for once instead of just reacting to all this shit. Stephanie let out a sigh as she folded up the map and fully turned her attention to me. That fire in you. I remember when I used to have it too, but then I realized this place doesn't give two shits about your intentions, your character, your family. It'll rip you apart without batting an eye and leave you in the dirt like trash for the crows. She ran a hand through her graying hair as she continued. Do yourself a favor, hon. Go find yourself a nice comfy job or a man in California or New York, any one of them places. You'll live longer. I was left speechless, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. How could I just run away with my tail between my legs and pretend everything is normal again? Go back to the dorms with the same girls gossiping about the same guys, reading the same magazines. Stephanie muttered an apology between a sigh and turned to walk away, but I said something before she could. I'm done running from this. I knew she heard me, but she didn't say anything. I walked away to my truck and sat in the padded seat after that with all my gear ready to go. I wondered where I would even go after this. Would they just stick me behind a desk at some visitor center or a booth at some campgrounds? And that's exactly what they did. Despite the bodies being found and the uniforms crawling everywhere, the campgrounds weren't empty. The trails stayed open. If anything, I found myself handing out more camping permits than usual. It's like all the commotion was attracting curious tourists. I even heard from one of the out-of-towners bragging about our park being on CNN. It was like some new theme park attraction to them. Tour buses full of tourists with SLRs hanging around their necks and camcorders strapped to their hands seemingly flooded the park in a matter of days. They seemed hell-bent on the fame of being the one to snap a photo of these man-eating animals, as they called them. Despite all my warnings I tried to give them, like staying on the trail and not wandering off, not going hiking at night, always bringing bear spray, locking up smellables. It didn't matter. It was useless. Their eyes glazed over as soon as my words left my mouth. Just as I was about to wonder if Steph and Jake were right, I overheard someone mentioning that the guy that was supposed to work in Tower 3 never showed because of the headlighting scaring everyone. I knew at that moment this could be my only chance to make things right. Jake raised an eyebrow at my request to man Tower 3, but he didn't ask many questions. He just sighed and penned me in without giving me too much fuss anymore. He muttered that I'd be starting next week before I left work for the day. Like the end of all my shifts as of late, I found myself driving to the only video store in town. It was the centerpiece of the one strip mall that Ravenwood could claim to hold. The windows of the store were plastered with posters of that newish Die Hard movie all the guys at work talked about during smoke breaks. I found myself wandering to blank tape section as the overhead lights buzzed above me. The scent of day-old popcorn and plastic filled my nostrils. My thumb trailed over the shelves crammed with brightly designed cases of empty tapes. I grabbed a few and tossed them in my basket. On the other side of the store, I could hear the chattering voices of a pair of kids as they excitedly flipped through those Nintendo Power magazines and squealed about new 3D games. I found myself cracking a smile at their excited voices as I stood in line at the register. As the cashier started to scan my tapes, he smiled at me and remarked how I must get lonely watching all those tapes by myself, how that could always change. I almost giggled like a schoolgirl at just how normal it seemed. After everything, just getting hit on by some guy at a store who was probably still a senior in high school felt so alien to me. Every part of me wanted to say yes, but I knew I couldn't. I gave him a nervous smile and apologized and told him I wouldn't be good company. He just sort of nodded and said maybe next time. I couldn't help but flinch when the TV behind him howled that scene from Jurassic Park where Muldoon gets his face ripped off by that raptor. His horrible screams all seemed familiar to me now, as he was ripped apart under the palm trees. I almost imagined hearing screams just like that at those campgrounds before Felix and I got there, whenever that elk was grabbing Jess's boyfriend and dragging him away as the scent of iron intertwined with burning firewood, and their screams were drowned out by Nirvana. Even as I walked outside, I couldn't stop it repeating in my head over and over. A voice that was familiar to me called out, "Ash?" I turned to see Felix standing next to his truck with a collection of shitty action movies cradled under his arm. "Oh, hey," I greeted, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're alright? You look a little pale," he remarked as he raised an eyebrow at my current state. "I'm fine. I'm just a little tired," I said, forming a disarming smile, which seemed to satisfy him well enough for now. "Can't blame you. Heard you're going for tower duty. You planning on staying there for the rest of the season till the shitstorm blows over?" I shrugged and adjusted my grip on the bag of tapes in my hand. "Something like that. Why do you ask?" He hummed a little and reached into his Carhartt and pulled out a blank envelope. "Here, it's for you." "Is that?" I started, but he cut me off. "Just take it," he insisted as he pushed the envelope into my plastic bag at my side despite my protests. "I don't understand." Felix let out what I would call a dad grumble and focused his gaze at me. "Look, I know I can't talk you out of going out there, but I still just want you to be safe." I couldn't meet his gaze as my silence was the only answer I could provide. "You're gonna need more than whatever revolver Jake has you parading around in out there." I finally let out a sigh and accepted defeat, muttered out an acknowledgement. "Just make sure you zero the scope of any rifle you get, Annie Oakley." I let out a muffled groan. "You're such an ass," I muttered. "I know, I'm awful. If you need any help with getting a handle on one, let me know, alright?" He said, with a grin forming on his scraggly face. "Sure, thanks, Felix. This is..." "Don't mention it. Now I gotta run and return these tapes. Don't be stupid without me, alright?" "No promises," I said with a smirk, which earned me an eye roll from him as he brushed past me. He strode into the store, leaving me to my own devices once more. I clutched the plastic bag that held my only comforts for tonight tightly all the way to my car. To my surprise, the only sporting goods store was still open after dark. Everything about it looked unremarkable from the outside. It was just a wooden building with an arched roof with a half-lit sign above it that said Mike's Outdoor Supply Store. I finally grabbed the envelope from the bag and opened it up. Inside was a neat pile of hundreds that I didn't bother to count. Part of me didn't want to even look at this money, let alone think of using it. The envelope felt thicker than it should have in my hands. You really didn't have to do this for me. The fading sunlight cut a thin line against the horizon as I shuffled into the store. The door let out a bell-like chime as I stepped inside. The smell of gun oil, cheap chewing tobacco, and old furs washed over me as I took a few unsure steps forward. I pushed by shelves stuffed with fishing poles and camo jackets to the main counter. I smiled nervously at the store owner standing in front of a rack of rifles and shotguns. Handwritten toe tags swayed ever so slightly. The many stuffed heads of pronghorns and mule deer glared down at me with their dead eyes as I approached. The older man at the counter adjusted his surplus gun belt and smiled at me. I couldn't help but notice the occupied holster with a faded US pressed into the leather flap on it at his side, but I didn't say anything about it. "Evening, miss. What can I get for you?" I ran a hand through my long hair as I glanced over at the rack of rifles, not even sure where to begin or what to even get. Part of me wished I dragged Felix here with me. "Looking for a big game rifle?" I said, trying to sound like I knew what I wanted. "What are you hunting? Elk? Moose? Well, about this Springfield here?" He reached for a hefty rifle from the rack and locked the bolt to the rear before handing it to me. "That there'll put down anything with antlers this side of the Rockies." I found myself flinching from the rifle of wood and steel bearing its weight down on me. Wasn't really used to having anything heavier than a revolver on me. "Right, what about for something bigger like a grizzly? I'm working in a fire tower for the season and I wanted some peace of mind," I asked as I clumsily handed the clerk the rifle back. My eyes wandering the back counter till the glare of the setting sun flickered against a framed photo of the man standing in a river posing with a kid that was probably young enough to be his grandson. He had a proud smile on his face as the two of them showed off a sizable bass they caught. "Well, I got something a little heavier here. This Remington 700 BDL and 300 Win Mag." The excitable store owner handed me a scoped rifle of polished wood. I fussed with it for a second as I adjusted its sizable weight in my arms. "Heavy," I mumbled, and the hunter let out a chuckle. "Sure is. You don't want to be running a gun with that thing. You basically have to use it with sandbags or a bipod." "Alright, I'll take it. Can I get 2 boxes of ammo for it?" He nodded and placed 2 boxes of ammo on the counter in a flash. "If you're going to use it on Grizzly, you're going to want these. Federal soft points. This will give you a wallop." I nodded and let out a muttered gratitude as he set down official-looking paperwork in front of me after I handed the rifle back to him. "Out of state, right?" Yeah." He nodded once and set out a few pens for me. "That's fine. I just need your license, and I'll phone the sheriff. In the meantime, just need you to fill out this 4473 for me. I'll be back in a jiffy." It disappeared to the back of my license as I filled it out. Within a few minutes, he came back out and handed my ID back. "Everything looks good. You want a Harris? Sling? It's on me." "You don't have to." I let out a dejected huff as he insisted on putting on the bipod and sling for me, while he talked my ear off about his grandson's shooting his first gopher last week. The paperwork went by faster than I thought, and before I knew it, I was walking out the door. I bought a few more things with the envelope as I walked out with the rifle case. Even as I found myself back at that crummy cabin, I couldn't help but wonder if I was living on borrowed time. I set my things down and inserted the blank tape into the VCR and set it to record as my little cabin filled with the sound of melodramatic soap operas as the microwave buzzed as it spun a TV dinner around. I settled in the ugly couch that had been converted into a bed of sorts with sheets and proper pillows that I'd salvaged from my cot. I dug a fork into the processed Salisbury steak. I couldn't help but remember those weekday nights. Mom came home from the hospital in her scrubs with the scent of iodine and iron clinging to her, not even having the energy to do anything more than put some Swansons in the oven and call it dinner. Something about her weary eyes stopped me from complaining about how weird and watery the mashed potatoes tasted when I was younger. The memories of my childhood faded away as I lay down on the couch and tried my best to fall asleep. Every now and again, I would wake up in spurts and feed the VCR a new tape. The mediocre soap operas changing to infomercials and bogus psychic hotlines. I grumbled in annoyance as I switched sleeping positions and tried my best to go back to sleep. The days began to blur together of my desk job. It just felt like one big countdown till I switched over. What little time I spent off the job, I was with Felix at a property his buddy owned, zeroing that new rifle, blasting apart old Coke bottles and knocking down the metal outlines of deer. The rifle kicked like hell and was heavy as sin, but it packed a punch. That's all I really needed. The day before I was set to go out there, I spent the day packing my truck with gear I would need for what lay ahead. Felix insisted on helping me pack for the trip. I'm not sure why, but I appreciated it all the same. Just as I was closing up the truck, Felix's eyes drew to the worn canvas rifle case. So, that's for self-defense, right? He asked slowly. Yeah, we both know what's out there. Felix's brow furrowed and he inhaled once. I heard the flares, the boxes of ammo, the extra gas. That all for self-defense too? I remained silent as I fussed with the duffel bag's straps. He let out a tired exhale. No talking you out of this, is there? I have to do this, Felix. He shook his head and hissed through his teeth. Just be careful, all right? He finally relented, softening his voice a bit. I finally looked up at him and noticed moisture gathering up in the corner of his eyes. I stopped what I was doing, and without even thinking, I threw my arms around him. I'll be careful, I murmured into his shoulder. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but we said our final goodbyes and went our separate ways. I couldn't help but feel a dull ache in my chest for the rest of the day, like I was disappointing my dad all over again. I slipped 2 copies of that Polaroid into sealed envelopes. One addressed to the detective from the other night, and the other to the state attorney's office. The walk to the P.O. box felt like miles, but it didn't matter. I left early the next day under the cover of dawn's darkness. The glare of my high beam steadily guided my way as I traversed the unpaved surface roads. The scraggly trees gave way to a small clearing. Silhouetted in the rising sun, Tower 3 stood, taller than all the evergreens. The chain-link fence surrounding it, menacing with barbed wire, was the only thing that separated it from what lay within the forest. I took a moment to open the gate before I drove in. The feeling of being exposed only increased as I fiddled with the rusted padlocked road gate. For what felt like hours, I unloaded my truck and ferried my supplies up and down those creaky stairs. I wandered into one of the cheaply made outer buildings with a gas can in hand to feed the old red Honda generator. I flipped the choke on and the power switch. I yanked on the pull cord, letting out a few words that would make a church lady faint. After a few tries, the generator coughed and sputtered before finally roaring to life as the scent of burning fuel filled the air. I finally settled into the tower itself for the morning check-in. The solitary bulb hanging above me buzzed as I fiddled with the radio's knobs. I grabbed the receiver as I eyed one of the clipboards with the handwritten cheat sheet from one of the previous rangers. "Base, this is Tower 3. An older woman's voice crackled from the other end.
Go ahead.
"I'm in service. Weather's clear. Temperature is 65 degrees. Low wind speed. Over."
Good copy. Keep an eye out.
I fussed with the firefinder for hours as I did my rounds. My eyes could never stop drifting towards the tree line, like I would see it there, waiting for me. I looked over at the wall rifle rack, the same kind you would find in your grandpa's hunting cabin. Basically just a board with 2 pegs to keep the gun from falling off the wall. The rifle that I'd spent weeks training with rested there, just in case. I scanned above the trees with my heavy binos. I knew it was out there. I didn't know why or how, but for some reason I just did. I still had a job to do. In between bouts of paranoia, I wrote all the weather and temperature reports in the logbook that was as big as a phone book. I had a miserable breakfast of canned ravioli that I didn't feel like heating up, and a cup of Nescafe that tasted like tires and chalky dried creamer. Hours of mundane routine were filled with constant surveying. Even as I did another once-over of my binos, I noticed something odd among the trees. An almost skeletal tree, its branches blackened and barren from a lightning strike. Perched amongst the jagged limbs were the hunched forms of turkey vultures. Their distinctive crimson heads made the undead tree look like it was bleeding. The wake of vultures crowded every space as they unfurled their massive brown and black wings in the late afternoon sun. The lines of white on their underwings looked as if bones jutted out from the branches. The silent vigil's gaze was drawn to only one place. The aged spruce that stood beside them understood why in mere seconds. Scattered across the needles were the remains of a doe, too high up to be the work of a mountain lion. Its carcass was already meticulously pulled apart like a toddler of Play-Doh. The only way I could tell it used to be a deer was its cloven hooves dangling blissfully in the canopy. The wind blew just once over the trees, and with it, it carried the faint scent of ammonia. The carcass-ridden pine thrashed once from something below. The vultures sprang into flight as they glided through the warm gusts. I lowered the binoculars with a muted shudder, tearing my eyes away from this awful sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever did this was closer than I thought. I couldn't help but wonder if I was out of my depth. Should I have just taken Jake's offer, listened to Steph's advice? It was probably too late to turn back now. I still tried to act normally for the rest of the day, like if I just ignored it all, it might go away. Chop firewood for the night, make sure the generator wasn't running dry on fuel, filling up water jugs from the hand pump below, just anything to keep my mind busy. The shadows lengthened as the sun retreated behind the snow-capped mountains. I double-checked that the padlock held the gate shut, but I knew it probably wouldn't do much good to stop what's out there. I went back to the tower and tried to distract myself with filling out logs, but then my VHF crackled to life.
Tower 3, this is Tower 4. How copy?
I grumbled and fetched the receiver. "Tower 3 here. Go ahead."
Yeah, I got eyes on some smoke near the ridge about bearing 130 and looks like about a mile from me. Can you confirm that over?
"Yep, good copy. I'll take a look over." I grabbed the spotter from the corner of the room and carried it out to the balcony. I set up the tripod and looked through the scope after adjusting the focus. Sure enough, a wispy haze of grayish smoke silhouetted itself against the ridge. I slipped back inside to get a proper bearing from the Osborne. I adjusted the sights and stared through the crosshairs, jotting down a quick smoke report before keying back up. "Tower 3 again. I got eyes on. It's about 115 degrees on my end. Same ridge. Looks like an illegal campsite off trail."
That's a good copy. I'll set up to the office and get a truck out there.
Appreciate it. Tower 4 out.
Just like that, I was alone again. The night fell faster than I thought, despite the long summer days. I did my last check-in for the night and started to cook over the hissing Coleman. It was basically just a hamburger helper and some canned ground beef, but it was warm and took my mind off what I would do next. I kept my rifle loaded, ready to go at a moment's notice on the rack. I got the wood stove going when the chill and nocturnal started to choke the tower. I curled up in the thin cot. The crackling fire and the howling wind stirring in the night held me for hours before sleep took me. When the rising sun finally drew me out of sleep, I spent the morning fiddling with the PA system that was left from the Carter days. With some effort, I managed to jerry-rig it to my Discman, but not for my own comfort. It would probably sound butchered and strangled, but it would do just fine. I took the rifle down from the rack and slung it over my shoulder, and fussed with the sling as it drooped a bit too far down my back. I ventured down the creaky stairs to my truck and dug out the cooler from the bed. The half-frozen ice sloshed around as I ungracefully hoisted it down. I dragged the wheeled cooler out of one of the side gates and prepared myself mentally before finally mustering up the strength to open the cooler. The rank stench of rotting fish guts and iron greeted me plainly as the half-frozen chum blocks swirled around. I did my best to not breathe in through my nose as I dumped the cooler out in a neat little line along the fence line. I was about to take the cooler back inside when I heard an uncharacteristically loud branch snapping from somewhere in the nearby brush. The footfalls of something large approached. I reached for my rifle over my shoulder. Another crash in the other bush neared close to me as I chambered around and brought the stock to my shoulder and started to back away towards the gate. A dark shape lumbered out of the shrubs. I quickly noticed its soft ears flopping and it moving in a dopey gait. I realized it was just a black bear. It curiously sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it sauntered over to the thawing chum block. It froze when it saw me standing there with the rifle and chuffed. I loaded my rifle and reached for the bear spray in my belt. I took my whistle from around my neck and blew 3 sharp bursts. It looked almost annoyed I was there as it chomped its jaws and waddled away. I let out a sigh and went back to the tower. I tried to act normal for the rest of the day. I acted like nothing was going to happen, but I knew it was a lie. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, I zipped up a hunting vest that was the smallest size I could find. It had everything I needed for tonight. It sagged around my shoulders, but it was enough for what I needed. I grabbed the rifle from the rack for the last time and stared out at those lines and lines of pines hanging in the darkness. I slipped on a pair of earplugs for my vest and grabbed the radio. With a heavy breath, I pushed down the emergency panic button on my VHF as my radio began to squawk with the office asking if I was okay. I didn't answer as I started to play the music on my Discman through the tower's PA. I flicked on the exterior lights before stepping out to the balcony. They provided just enough hazy light to see my target. The Nirvana tracks were almost choked through the dusty speakers. The riffs crackled in protest, but they never stopped. I was never into rock that much, but at this moment, with everything that happened here, all those times I could only watch while bodies were hauled out, and more missing person posters filled the visitor center, I understood it now. The raw power you felt listening to the guitar chugging, the drums pumping. Kurt Cobain's screams of rage tore across the pines, filling me with an awful fury I hadn't felt before. Despite how loud the music was, a familiar yet gut-wrenching mockery of the sounds of nature answered my challenge. A whiff of bleach in the wind told me all I needed to know. I tied a bandana across my face. I couldn't lose my focus. Not now. I cycled the action once and unfolded the bipod, letting it rest on the guardrail. I waited. Just for a moment, I saw it, standing just ahead of the tree line. The chimera was there. Its many heads glared up at me. I reached into my vest and pulled out a flare pistol. I raised it into the air and fired it. It wasn't as bright as Stephanie's flare, but the other towers would see it. The red glow from the flare painted its silhouette plainly to me as I brought my cheek to the stock. I set the focus and lined up a shot. Much to my annoyance, it didn't stay still. My finger curled around the trigger. Its massive form started to try to barrel itself over the fence, but it only ended up getting itself caught on the barbed wire. It howled with fury as its heads tried to pluck out the wires. It slowed it just enough to get my first shot off. The rifle's roar traveled up my entire body and settled in my chest with each round I fired. I squeezed the trigger as I was trying to pull the fence down with its sickly limb. I was glad the vest had padded shoulders as the rifle bucked me hard with its recoil. A shriek of pain that was quickly drowned out by grunge filled the night. Dust and rocks were kicked up, but I was sure I hit it. It jerked and thrashed as it seemed more feverishly to rip the wire out of its body, the chain link began to sag and buckle from the weight of that unnatural thing as it kept pushing through. The barbed wire wrapped itself around some of its limbs as fence posts started to get pulled out of the cracked concrete. I racked the bolt and chambered the next round, trying to maintain a count of how many I'd left in the rifle. Just as it was about to free itself from the fence, I squeezed off a second round. It stumbled again and let out another shriek, but it didn't stop. I hissed in irritation and injected the smoking brass. Just how many fucking rounds is this thing gonna take? It limped towards the tower faster than I thought. I adjusted my angle, but I rushed it too much and the next shot just barely missed it. Shit, I muttered as I noticed the rifle empty on rounds. I felt my stomach drop as the faded wooden tower shuddered from something grabbing a hold. With trembling hands, I tried to feed a new round from the sling, but it slipped between my shaking fingers. I hissed out a curse as I looked over the edge for where it might be now, but I couldn't see it anywhere. The music quieted down, just for a moment, to feel my own heart pounding in my chest. My eyes widened when I heard a single beam creak from the weight of something new. A shape lunged for me in the corner of my eye. I unclipped my holster as I turned around as fast as I could. A bear's head with its misshapen maw lunged for my neck, but I moved just enough for it to grab my shoulder instead. Its teeth tore into my shoulder. I didn't even register that I was screaming at first, but I was. All I remember was the cold sensation of my hand tightly gripping around the .38. Without even thinking, I pressed into the side of its head and pulled the trigger. I expected to hear a loud bang, but I only heard a fleshy thump as bone fragments and gray matter finally ejected out of the exit wound, and the head went completely slack-jawed instantly. A light mist of blood covered my shooting hand. I tore myself away from the chimera as it sagged, just barely holding itself from completely falling from the roof. I backed away until I slammed into the railing and panic-fired the other 5 in the cylinder, but it didn't seem to be as effective. I kept pressure on my bleeding shoulder as I rushed down the stairs away from it. I stopped halfway and slid open the revolver. I tipped the sidearm over and punched the ejector rod, dumping the smoking casings. I was huffing and puffing while I fought with the snap on the stiff leather speedloader pouch. My slick hand slipped a few times before I was able to finally yank out the speedloader. The cylinder slipped on me twice as I frantically tried to jam in the speedloader. By the third try, I managed to line it up, twisted the knob, slid in a fresh 6, and slammed the revolver closed. I stopped again when I heard the sound of something metallic dragging against wood. I reached into the vest's game pocket and pulled out a marine flare. I yanked off the cap and struck the flare head against the striker like a match. After a few tries, The flare hissed to life as my vision was filled with a blinding red. The crimson-gray smoke obscured my vision just a bit, but not enough to see the shape of that spider-like being hanging from the tower as a wolf's head lunged for my throat for the killing blow. This time, I was faster. I ducked like I was playing dodgeball again, and before it had a chance to position itself to strike again, I slammed the burning stick of magnesium into its eye socket. The repulsive stench of burning fur overpowered me quickly, even with the bandana over my face. It screamed bloody murder as it thrashed and seized from the unbearable agony. Somehow, it still held on to the tower despite it all. But it still gave me just enough time to run down to my truck. The dull burning sensation of my wound started to weigh on me as the adrenaline started to wear off. My shoulder was already soaked as I felt warm liquid travel down my arm. I reached the tower's base and limped to my truck. I yanked out the heavy tin of the first aid kit from the bed and threw myself into the driver's seat. The red glow of the marine flare fell freely as it landed unceremoniously, covered in charred skin and singed hairs. I frantically dug into the kit, yanking out the 5 different kinds of band-aids and aspirin until I managed to find something more substantial. I ripped open the clinical packaging, the white already becoming stained with my blood. I shoved a combine pad onto my shoulder and ripped a few strips of duct tape with my teeth and slapped it on. It wasn't pretty, but it was enough for now to stop the bleeding. My head dipped for a second as a wave of dizziness washed over me. I fought my own body to stay awake just for a little longer. I stared at a Chevy's engine as it rumbled to life. The Chimera slunk down like a snake from the faded wooden foundations. It moved slower now, unevenly. Parts of its fur were matted with its own blood. The mockery of the hound's head had my mark on it. Half its face was almost burned away entirely. Its bones were blackened and charred. The skin barely clung on. Its crowded, uneven teeth now exposed to me. It dragged behind some of its larger, crooked limbs, now encased in the barbed wire's teeth. I couldn't help but smile almost gleefully. My slick, trembling hands gripped the steering wheel. A single thought crossed my primal brain that filled me with an intoxicating high of newfound power. I put on my seatbelt and slammed my foot down on the gas. The tires welled in protest before my truck barreled forward. I shifted up a gear as my speed soared. I didn't have time to react before I crashed into it. I felt the impact shake the entire cabin. The seatbelt painfully dug into my chest as it locked my torso in place. My head slammed forward into the steering wheel. I was honestly surprised the impact didn't knock me unconscious. A sharp pain shooting to my lower back seemed to be enough to keep me awake. A misshapen hoof wildly kicked through my windshield. Slivers of laminated glass fell into my lap as the creature's hoof twitched to get a better angle on me. My vision narrowed as I reached for my holster. I could barely see its shape out of the spiderwebbed glass, but it didn't stop me from accelerating. It let out a furious shriek as my Smith & Wesson left its holster. With shaking hand, I slapped the trigger again and again, each round putting a new hole into my windshield as tiny shards of glass peppered my face. My gaze settled on the form of a boulder bigger than a bison. I grinned as I plowed towards, with the Chimera still clinging to my hood. The truck thrashed when I made contact, pinning the Chimera between the boulder and my truck. It felt like a sledgehammer punching into my ribs when the airbags finally deployed, knocking the wind out of me. The hood of my truck hissed and smoked with a sizable dent torn through the grille. My wound jostled as I let out a cry. Blood ran down my brow as I gasped for breath. That thing from the woods seemed to still be alive. It desperately tried to claw its way out, but it was useless. The tires squealed and smoked as I kept pumping the gas to keep it trapped. I ripped off the seatbelt and practically fell out of the truck onto my knees. I panted heavily as I lumbered to my vehicle, holding onto the sides for support until I grabbed a big jerry can and limped my way back to the front of the car. The Chimera was panicking now, as its cloudy eyes locked on to what I held. It yelped almost pathetically like a kicked dog as it tried to somehow wiggle its way out. I splashed it several times with the gasoline until it was sufficiently soaked in fuel. I dropped the can and reached into my vest and pulled out the flare pistol. I fished out the empty shell and thumbed in a new one. Before I could take aim, a sudden, unbearable jolt of pain shot up my back. My legs buckled seemingly out of nowhere and gave up on supporting my weight entirely. I tumbled to the ground with a scream. I tried to get back up, but my legs wouldn't move. Tears quickly formed in the corner of my eyes. It couldn't be true. The Chimera stopped struggling and watched me silently, like it was quietly gloating in my suffering. In the mess of heads it stole, one settled its beady eyes on me. The head of a raven. It croaked out only 2 words in an awful scratchy voice that didn't belong to a human. Won't matter. Tears of rage now flowed freely as it mixed with the bleeding. I grit my teeth so hard it felt like they would crack. I raised the flare pistol and thumbed the hammer back. Burn! I spat through gritted teeth. I almost swore I saw terror in its milky eyes before I pulled the trigger, but it didn't matter. The flare barely even popped before the gasoline ignited. An effigy of what was once the Chimera burned like a comet. It thrashed, it screamed, it begged, or at least I think it did. The heat washed over the side of my face as I crawled away from the burning inferno. The stench of gas, death, and charred hair hung heavily in the night. Just over the ridge, the sound of approaching rotors drew near. I almost laughed, but the deep pain in my chest cut it short. The dark form of a helicopter flew low over me as its spotlight settled on me. I squinted and lowered my gaze from the bright light. The bird swung around and landed swiftly as smoke and dust and pebbles flowed in the air from its wash, through the wall of haze and dust. The tall forms of 2 uniformed men emerged from the darkness. State troopers wearing heavy black vests bulged with stitched-on pouches and large lettering that read State Police. Familiar-shaped helmets silhouetted them like Marines on TV standing in front of burning oil fields. Clear, thick goggles shielded them from the chopper's wash. They shouldered sleek black rifles that looked like they came out of Apocalypse Now. Long, cumbersome maglights were taped onto the handguards, casting thin beams of amber light through the smoke. The glow of their maglights fell on what lay behind me. I turned to see the flames smoldering now, the gasoline already burned away. Despite it all, it was still twitching and showing signs of clinging to life. "Shit! I got one! Still moving!" One of them shouted over the spinning blades. "Put him down!" The other barked, raising the rifle to his shoulder. The state troopers went to one knee and fired off a series of shots. The air vibrated as the crack of rounds easily made their mark. Their muzzle flashes painted the night. The Chimera finally stopped moving altogether as its heads rolled back in place. Wisps of smoke and dust curled around its bleeding form. One trooper edged closer and put 2 more rounds into the abomination's limp form. The 2 lawmen turned to me. One of them reached for his shoulder mic. The other kneeled beside me and held pressure on my shoulder. I grit my teeth as pain jolted my entire body. "Can you stand?" he asked me. "I can't feel my legs," I practically whimpered as tears now flowed freely down my face. Adam 6-3, shots fired. Scene's clear now. We found her, but she's in rough shape. I need that RA on me now. Despite how loud the rotors were, I could still hear his radio crackle as he swung a glowing chem light tied to 550 cord over his head like a spinning buzzsaw.
10-4, hang tight. RA's moving to you.
I could only stare up at the sky, feel the vibrations of the rotary wing settle in my entire body. My ears rang like church bells, the sound of my own shallow breathing, drowning out everything else. The edges of my vision swam with black dots. 2 men in dark blue flight suits suddenly stood over me with strange dome-shaped helmets. Oversized radio mics partially hid their lips from me. They both wore strange harnesses that were a mess of pouches, buckles, and straps. Their mouths moved, but I couldn't hear them anymore, as they shined penlights in my face. I struggled to keep my eyes open. The medic strapped something tight around my neck, but I was too dizzy to see what it was. My entire body was quickly cinched down by unseen hands. The sensation of being lifted into the air shortly followed. I turned my head one last time to gaze at the tower, still standing amongst the smoke. The PA speakers looped over and over of the voice of Nirvana, furiously screaming out 2 words: entertain us. Like it was some twisted call to action, but in that moment, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the first tragedy we bothered to even notice. There wouldn't be another summer for us to enjoy.